The air in the whispering woods was thick enough to drink, heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. For 3 years, this had been Seraphina's world. She moved through the dense undergrowth with a silence that was not taught, but earned. Her silver-white hair, once a celebrated feature at court, was now a practical braid, woven with leather strips and the occasional feather of a hawk. Her feet, wrapped in hardened deerskin, made no sound on the mossy ground. Ahead, through a lattice of ancient, gnarled branches, her target grazed. A magnificent stag, its antlers like a crown of dead wood, was oblivious to the predator stalking it. Seraphina's body was a taut line of muscle and intent. She was no longer Lady Seraphina Thorne, a delicate, noble woman praised for her grace. That woman had perished in the fire of betrayal. The person who remained was simply Sarah, a survivor. Her emerald green eyes, once soft with affection, were now sharp and calculating. They measured the distance, the wind, the slight tremble in the stag's flank, the thin scar along her jawline, a gift from her first failed attempt at hunting a wild boar, pulled tight as she drew back her bowstring. The yew-bow was her own in creation, its string woven from animal sinew. The arrow was fletched with crow feathers, its stone tip honed to a deadly point. She held her breath. The forest seemed to hold its breath with her. The only sound was the frantic beat of her own heart, a drum against her ribs. She remembered Fenris's teaching, his gravelly voice a rumble in her memory. The forest does not give, little cub. You must take what you need, but you must also respect the life you take. There was no malice in this act. It was a brutal, honest transaction. The stag's life for hers. Her survival through the coming winter depended on this meat, this hide. She released the string. The arrow flew true, a whisper of death cutting through the humid air. It struck the stag high on the shoulder, sinking deep. The animal let out a startled cry, a sound that echoed strangely in the suffocating quiet. It stumbled, tried to bolt, but its powerful legs betrayed it. It crashed to the ground, its life pouring out onto the dark, rich soil. Seraphina did not look away. She watched until the last tremor left its body, a silent prayer of thanks on her lips. It was a hard thing to take a life, but the forest had taught her that sentiment was a luxury she could no longer afford. Kneeling beside the great beast, she pulled the hunting knife from her belt. Its blade was worn, but sharp. As she began the difficult work of dressing the kill, her fingers, stained with dirt and now blood, brushed against the pendant that hung around her neck. It was always there, a cold weight against her skin. The moonstone amulet, a polished, milky white stone carved into the head of a howling wolf, set in tarnished silver. A betrothal gift. His gift. The cool, smooth surface was a stark contrast to the warm, sticky reality of her task. A wave of dizziness washed over her. The scent of pine and blood faded, replaced by the smell of beeswax, old stone, and cold fear. The forest dissolved, and for a heart-stopping moment, she was no longer a hunter in the wild. She was back in the great hall of Silverwood Keep, standing before the throne. The weight on her shoulders was not a leather pack filled with supplies, but a gown of emerald silk, so heavy it felt like armor. Hundreds of faces stared at her. The lords and ladies of the great clans, her friends, her peers. Their expressions were a mixture of shock, pity, and a chilling, hungry curiosity. The air crackled with tension, and on the high throne of dark timber sat Alistair Blackwood, her mate, her king, her betrayer. His jet-black hair seemed to absorb the torchlight, and his cobalt-blue eyes, the eyes she had loved with every fiber of her being, were as cold and hard as winter ice. He had not looked at her once since she was dragged into the hall by his royal guard. He addressed the court, his deep, resonant voice filling the vast chamber. It was the same voice that had whispered promises to her in the dark, the same voice that had sworn to protect her. Now it was a weapon turned against her. Lady Seraphina Thorne, he began, and her name from his lips was like a shard of glass in her gut. You stand accused of the highest treason. You have conspired with the Sunstone clan, our sworn enemies, to undermine the strength of this kingdom and to plot against the life of your Alpha King. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Her head snapped up, her eyes finally meeting his. She searched his face for any sign, any flicker of the man she knew. There was nothing, only a mask of cold, regal authority. "Alistair, no," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "This is madness. I have done nothing." "The evidence is undeniable," he continued, his gaze sweeping over the assembled nobles. He held up a scroll, its seal broken. "Letters, written in your own hand, promising our secrets to the Sunstone chieftain in exchange for power when I was gone." Her mind reeled. The letters were forgeries. They had to be. Her handwriting was easy to mimic, a skill taught to all noble children. But who? Why? She looked past Alistair to the man standing at the right hand of the throne, Lord Valerius Croft, his most trusted advisor. His thin lips were pressed into a somber line, but his cold gray eyes held a flicker of something else. Triumph. "These are lies," she cried, her voice finally breaking through her shock. She took a step forward, but the guard's hands clamped down on her arms, their grip like iron. "Alistair, look at me. You know me. You know I would never do this. I love you. I love our kingdom." For the first time, he looked directly at her. For a split second, she thought she saw a crack in his composure, a flash of agony, of regret, but it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by a chilling emptiness. "Your love is a poison," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone that cut her more deeply than any blade. "You have used your position, your closeness to the throne, to weave a web of deceit. For this betrayal, the law is clear. The penalty is death." Panic seized her breath caught in her throat. Death. The word hung in the air, monstrous and absolute. She saw her father's face in the crowd, his expression one of utter devastation. She saw the other lords exchanging cautious, calculating glances. They were wolves, all of them, sensing a shift in the power dynamic. Her fall was their opportunity. "But," Alistair said, raising a hand to silence the murmurs, "because of the love I once held for you, and in honor of the Thorn bloodline that has served this kingdom, I will show mercy." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "You will not be executed. Instead, you are hereby stripped of your name, your titles, and your lands. You are an outcast. You will be exiled to the Whispering Woods, to live or die by your own strength. If you ever set foot in the lands of this kingdom again, you will be hunted down and destroyed like any common rogue." The sentence was worse than death. It was a living torment, to be cast out alone into the most dangerous forest in the realm, a place from which no one ever returned. Her knees buckled, and she would have collapsed if not for the guards holding her up. Tears streamed down her face, hot and useless. She looked at him, pleading without words. "Please, not this. Anything but this." He stood, his imposing frame casting a long shadow over her. He reached out and, with a terrifying gentleness, his fingers closed around the moonstone amulet at her throat. For a wild moment, she thought he would rip it from her. Instead, he simply held it, his thumb brushing over the carved wolf's head. "So that you never forget the price of betrayal," he whispered, his voice for her ears alone. "So you remember what you threw away." Then he let go, turned his back on her, and walked away. The last thing she saw of her king was his broad back, retreating as her world fell apart. The sudden cry of a nightbird snapped Seraphina back to the present. She was kneeling on the forest floor, her knuckles white where she gripped her knife. The stag was half-dressed, its body cooling rapidly as twilight bled through the canopy. Her face was wet with tears she hadn't realized she was crying. Her hand was clenched around the moonstone amulet, its coldness a familiar, painful anchor. 3 years. 3 years, and the memory still had the power to gut her, to leave her breathless and shaking. She wiped her face with the back of her grimy hand, forcing the ghosts away. Crying was pointless. It solved nothing. It did not butcher a stag, or build a fire, or fortify her crude shelter against the things that stalked the night. She worked faster now, her movements efficient and practiced. The past was a cage, and she had fought too hard for her freedom to be trapped by it again. She was not that broken girl in the throne room anymore. The woods had burned that weakness out of her. By the time she had finished, the last vestiges of light had vanished. The woods were now a realm of deep shadows and unseen movements. She loaded the best cuts of meat onto a makeshift travois, covering the rest of the carcass with branches to protect it from scavengers until she could return for the hide. The work was grueling, and her muscles ached with a satisfying burn. This was a pain she understood. It was honest. It was real. And as she started the slow drag back toward her camp, a subtle shift in the air made her freeze. It was not a sound or a sight. It was a feeling, a prickling sensation that traveled up her spine and made the fine hairs on her arms stand on end. Her senses, honed by years of solitude and constant vigilance, screamed a warning. Something was wrong. She lifted her head, tasting the air. There was the familiar scent of moss, wet stone, and pine. But underneath it, carried on a faint breeze from the south, was something else. A scent she had not smelled in 1,095 days. A scent she had prayed every single night she would never smell again. It was the scent of power, of dominance, the unmistakable scent of an alpha. But it was more than that. It was specific, it was personal, it was him. Her blood ran cold, then hot with a sudden, violent surge of adrenaline. It couldn't be, he wouldn't dare. Her territory, the small section of this endless forest she had claimed and defended with blood and sweat, was miles beyond the kingdom's official borders. No one came this far, no one but the lost and the damned. Why would he be here? The scent grew stronger, closer. He was moving fast, with a purpose. He had crossed the stream that marked her southern boundary. He was invading her sanctuary, the only home she had left. All the pain, the humiliation, the rage she had spent 3 years burying under the hard labor of survival erupted. The carefully constructed walls around her heart cracked. The raw, feral grief she felt that day in the throne room came roaring back, but this time it was not coupled with despair. It was forged into pure, unadulterated fury. She abandoned the travois, leaving the precious meat without a second thought. Her survival instincts were screaming, but they were drowned out by a more primal, more powerful urge: the need for confrontation, for retribution. Her hand went not to her bow, but to the weapon that leaned against a nearby tree. It was a long, fire-hardened spear, its tip a jagged piece of obsidian she had spent weeks shaping. It was a brutal, ugly weapon, a weapon for close, vicious work. Her heart pounded in her chest, a frantic rhythm of fear and rage. Fear of the power he held, of the memories he brought with him. Rage at his audacity, his intrusion, his very existence. He had taken her life, her name, her future. He would not take this from her too. This small patch of earth was hers. She had bled for it. She would defend it. She grabs her hand-forged spear, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and rage, and moves silently toward the intruder. The forest floor was a tapestry of damp earth and decaying leaves, a terrain she knew better than any ballroom carpet. Each step was a silent promise, a soft press of her leather-wrapped feet against the ground. Her breath was a steady, controlled cloud in the chilled night air. The spear felt like an extension of her own arm, its fire-hardened tip hungry for contact. The scent of the intruder was stronger now, a strange mix of winter pine, ozone, and something else beneath it, a scent like old ashes and regret. It was a wolf's scent, powerful and dominant, a scent that clawed at the edges of a memory she had tried for 3 years to bury. She moved between the ancient sentinels of the woods, their gnarled branches reaching down like skeletal fingers. Her heart was not pounding with fear. It was a cold, hard drum beating a rhythm of war inside her ribs. Fear was a luxury she had shed along with her silks and jewels. Fear was for the girl who had trusted a handsome alpha with a voice like honey and eyes the color of a summer sky. That girl was gone, while somewhere between a gilded throne room and the unforgiving maw of this forest. All that remained was the survivor, the huntress. And the huntress smelled a threat to her territory. The scent led her to the edge of the small clearing that served as her camp. A crude lean-to stood against the base of a massive oak. Her fire pit was a circle of cold stones, and standing in the center of it all, bathed in a sudden cruel wash of moonlight, was a figure. He was tall and broad-shouldered, a silhouette of power that made the air itself seem to bend around him. He stood perfectly still, his head tilted slightly as if listening for her approach. He knew she was there. He was waiting. Seraphina froze behind the trunk of a towering pine, the rough bark pressing into her cheek. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the spear. It was him. Even in the shifting shadows, she knew. The way he held his head, the proud set of his shoulders that even now seemed burdened by an invisible weight. The years had changed him. He looked older than 30, the stark moonlight carving new lines of exhaustion around his eyes and mouth. His jet-black hair, once so perfect, was longer now, wilder with a shocking trace of silver at the temples. He wore no crown, no regal finery, just dark, practical leather trousers and a tunic that looked as travel-worn as her own clothes. A wave of nausea and white-hot rage crashed over her. It was so potent it almost brought her to her knees. The memories she fought daily came unbidden, a torrent of poison flooding her mind. Alistair, standing before the assembled pack lords, his voice ringing with false conviction. His cobalt blue eyes so full of feigned sorrow as he held up the forged letters. Treason, he had called it. He had accused her of conspiring with their enemies, of plotting his demise. He had stripped her of her name, her honor, her home. He had looked at her, the woman he claimed to love, and cast her out to die. The world narrowed to a single point, the man in her clearing, the architect of her ruin, the ghost who had haunted every waking moment and stalked her nightmares. Her training, the brutal lessons the forest and the old wolf Fenris had taught her, took over. Her muscles coiled, the cold drum of her heart became a frantic, thunderous beat. She was no longer thinking. She was pure, condensed instinct. An animal cornered and ready to strike. With a guttural cry that was more beast than human, she burst from the tree line. She covered the distance between them in a handful of powerful ground-eating strides. He turned his head fully at the sound, his eyes widening almost imperceptibly as she came at him. A wraith of silver hair and fury, he made no move to draw a weapon. He did not even raise his hands. His stillness was an insult, a final act of arrogance that fanned the flames of her hatred into an inferno. She did not slow. The spear came up, the sharpened point aimed directly at the hollow of his throat. She slammed into him with the full force of her momentum. The impact drove him back a step, his boots skidding on the damp earth. The tip of her spear pressed hard against his skin, right above the strong column of his neck. A single perfect droplet of blood welled around the point, a tiny crimson star against his pale skin. Her arms were locked, her entire body a rigid line of intent. One push, one final, desperate shove was all it would take to sever his life from this world, just as he had severed hers. They stood locked in that terrible embrace, chests heaving. The only sounds were their ragged breaths and the distant hoot of an owl. Her emerald green eyes, Weldon feral, blazed into his. She wanted him to beg. She wanted to see fear in those piercing, blue eyes that had lied to her so easily. She wanted him to understand the depths of the hell he had created for her. But she saw no fear. He did not flinch from the spear point digging into his flesh. He did not look at the weapon that promised his end. His gaze was fixed entirely on her face, and in his eyes, she saw something that shattered her rage into a million confusing pieces. It was not arrogance or pity. It was a raw, bottomless desperation that seemed to pull at the very air around them. It was the look of a man who had walked through his own personal hell and found it wanting. It was the look of a man who had lost everything and knew it. His eyes traced the lines of her face as if memorizing a ghost. He saw the new hardness in her jaw, the thin white scar that ran along her cheekbone from a boar tusk, the weathered tint of her skin. He saw the hunter she had become. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with 3 years of unspoken pain. Her muscles screamed with the effort of holding him at bay. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to finish it. To grant herself the justice the world had denied her, this was her chance. Her vengeance stood breathing before her, vulnerable and undefended. Why was he not fighting back? Why did he just stand there, accepting the point of her spear as if it were a penance? The man who had been king, the alpha of alphas, seemed to have shrunk inside his own skin. The power that had once rolled off him in palpable waves was still there, but it was frayed, cracked like dry earth. He looked utterly, hopelessly tired. The sight was so jarring, so contrary to the monster she had built up in her mind, that a tremor of confusion ran through her. This was not the triumphant tyrant she had imagined hunting down for sport. This was a broken man. His lips parted, and for a heart-stopping moment, she thought he would finally speak. That he would offer some excuse, some justification that would reignite her fury and allow her to act. She braced for it, prayed for it. She needed the anger. The anger was simple. The anger was clean. Without it, there was only the suffocating, complex agony of what they had once been to each other. The moonstone amulet, hidden beneath her tunic, felt suddenly as cold as a shard of ice against her skin. It was his betrothal gift. She had never been able to bring herself to throw it away. He didn't offer an excuse. He didn't plead for his life. He simply looked at her, his gaze holding a universe of torment and a sorrow so profound it was almost a physical force. He ignored the weapon that could end him in the next heartbeat. He ignored the blood trickling slowly down his neck, staining the collar of his tunic. He ignored everything but her. Then he spoke. His voice was not the booming command of a king. It was a low, ragged whisper, rough with exhaustion and something that sounded terrifyingly like grief. It was a voice she had not heard in an eternity, yet knew as well as her own name. And it was not her full name he used, not the formal title of the lady he had condemned. He used the name that only he had ever been allowed to use, the name he had whispered against her skin in the dark of night, in a lifetime that felt like it belonged to someone else. Sarah, he breathed. The name was a key, turning a lock deep inside her she thought had rusted shut forever. It bypassed the warrior. It slipped past the hunter. It struck the ghost of the girl she had been, and her hand, the hand that held the fate of a king, began to tremble. The sound of her name, a single word whispered from his lips, was a ghost she had buried 3 years ago. It broke through the wall of her rage with an intimacy that was unbearable. Her hand trembled. Just a fraction, but it was enough. The smooth wood of the spear shaft suddenly felt slick against her palm, a betrayal by her own body. The sharp steel tip, which had been so steady a moment before, now wavered against the skin of his throat. A single drop of blood, dark in the firelight, welled up where the point had pricked him. He did not flinch. His cobalt eyes, once so full of command and cold fire, were now just dark pools of exhaustion. For 1,095 days she had rehearsed this moment. In her dreams, she had met him on a field of battle, her fury a righteous storm. She had met him in the cold halls of Silverwood Keep, her words sharp enough to cut him down before the entire court. In every version, she was strong, she was avenged, she was whole. But none of her fantasies had prepared her for this, for the quiet desperation in his face, for the weary slump of his broad shoulders, for the sound of her own name spoken like a prayer from the man who had destroyed her. "It was a lie, Sarah," Alistair said, his voice a low rumble, rough with disuse and something that sounded like shame. The words were quiet, but they struck her with the force of a physical blow. Her mind recoiled, refusing to understand. The fire crackled, spitting embers into the darkness, the only sound in the sudden, ringing silence. "Everything," he continued, his gaze finally dropping from her eyes to the point of the spear. "The conspiracy with the Ridgeback clan, the letters, the whispers of treason. I invented it all." Seraphina's breath hitched. A cold dread, far worse than anger, began to creep through her veins. Her fury had been a shield. It was clean and pure, a fire that had kept her warm through the lonely, brutal nights. This feeling, this hollow, sickening confusion, was something else entirely. It was a poison. Waha! The word was torn from her, a raw, ragged sound. It was not the commanding demand she had imagined for years. It was the plea of a woman whose entire reality was crumbling. Alistair looked up again, and the self-loathing in his eyes was so profound it almost made her look away. "Because I was a fool," he said, the admission costing him dearly. "I was ambitious. The old king was weak. The clans were fracturing. Lord Valerius, he found a prophecy. He told me it spoke of a lone wolf who would unite the packs and save the kingdom from a coming darkness." He paused, a bitter, humorless smile touching his lips. "It said the Alpha King must stand alone, unburdened by a mate whose bloodline was tied to the old ways. It said that bond was a weakness he could not afford. I wanted the throne, Sarah. I wanted it more than anything. I believed I was the only one strong enough to hold our world together. So I chose power. I chose the prophecy over you. The spear sagged in her grip. The strength drained from her arms, from her entire body. 3 years. 3 years she had built her hatred like a fortress, stone by stone. He had just demolished it with a single devastating confession. The woman he had stood before the entire court and branded a traitor, the woman he had cast out to die in the wilderness, was not an enemy. She was simply in the way. Her suffering was not the result of some grand political scheme. It was the byproduct of one man's naked ambition. The pain was a physical thing. It was a pressure in her chest so immense she felt her ribs might crack. It was not the sharp, clean pain of a wound, but the deep, crushing ache of a soul breaking. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and unwelcome. She would not cry for him. She had sworn she would never cry for him again. Yet here they were, tracing cold paths down her cheeks, each one a testament to a grief she thought she had long since mastered. She let the spear fall. It clattered against the stones at her feet with a sound of finality. Alistair took a hesitant step forward, his hands slightly raised as if to calm a startled animal. She flinched back, a hiss escaping her lips. "Don't touch me," she whispered, her voice shaking with the effort of holding herself together. He stopped immediately, his hands falling to his sides. "I know," he said softly. "I do not deserve to even be in your presence. But my reasons for being here now are more important than my pride. They are more important than my shame." He gestured vaguely to the world beyond her small camp, to the vast, dark forest and the kingdom that lay beyond it. The prophecy Valerius found was a lie, or at least a misinterpretation. But the darkness it mentioned, that part was real. It is here. We call it the Blight. Seraphina wiped angrily at her tears with the back of a dirty hand, her gaze narrowing. She listened, her mind numb, her heart a hollow cavern where fury used to live. "It started subtly," Alistair explained, his voice taking on a grim, urgent tone. "A patch of farmland turning sour, crops withering on the vine, the soil gray and dead. Then it spread. Entire groves of trees became brittle, their leaves crumbling to black dust. The rivers began to run sluggish, coated with an oily black moss that chokes the life from the water." His description sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the night air. She thought of the vibrant, thriving life in her part of the woods. The deer she hunted, the herbs she gathered, the ancient trees that gave her shelter. The idea of that life turning gray and rotten was a new kind of horror. "But it is what it does to our people that is the true terror," Alistair continued, his voice dropping lower. "It is a magical corruption, Sarah. When it infects a wolf, it drives them mad. They become feral, not with the clean spirit of the wild, but with a mindless, vicious rage. Their veins turn black. You can see them pulsing beneath their skin. Their eyes glow with a sickening red light. They attack anything that moves, pack brother, mate, kin. It makes no difference. They are lost." He ran a hand through his dark hair, the gesture frayed with desperation. "I have tried everything. My alpha power, the strength of the royal guard, the wisdom of the elders. Nothing stops it. For every blighted wolf we put down, 2 more fall to the madness. For every acre of land the seers try to cleanse, a mile of it dies. The kingdom is rotting from the inside out. My kingdom." The way he said it, my kingdom, was different now. It was not the proud boast of a conqueror. It was the agonized cry of a man watching everything he fought for, everything he sacrificed for, turn to ash in his hands. Seraphina stared at him, the pieces of the terrible puzzle clicking into place. His weariness, the desperate journey into the woods he himself had banished her to. He had not come seeking forgiveness. He had come because he was beaten. The great Alpha King, the man who had remade the world in his image, was powerless. The irony was so bitter it tasted like bile in her throat. He had thrown her away to save his kingdom, and his kingdom was dying anyway. A part of her, a dark and vengeful part, felt a sliver of satisfaction. It was a cold, ugly feeling, and she hated herself for it, but it was there. Let it burn, she thought. Let his precious kingdom fall. Let him feel a fraction of the desolation she had felt, waking up each morning in this unforgiving wilderness. But then she looked past him, into the deep breathing darkness of the whispering woods. This was her home now, the ancient trees, the silent creatures, the whispering wind. It had taken her in when the world of men had cast her out. The thought of the blight creeping through these trees, twisting the wolves into mindless monsters, poisoning the very earth that had sustained her, that thought brought a fresh wave of pain. This was no longer just his problem. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "What do you want from me? Do you expect me to feel pity for you, Alistair? Do you want my blessing as your world collapses?" "No," he said, shaking his head. He looked directly at her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something beyond desperation in his eyes. It was a fragile, terrifying hope. "My seers have been searching the ancient texts, looking for any legend, any myth that might offer a solution. Weeks ago, they found one, a reference to a power that can cleanse the land of magical corruption, a power that can soothe the feral mind and heal the blighted spirit." He took a slow, deliberate breath, as if bracing himself. "It is not a power an Alpha King can wield. It is not a power that comes from strength or command. It is a deep foundational magic, a magic of the earth itself, and it is tied inextricably to a single ancient bloodline." Seraphina stood frozen, the cold dread returning with a vengeance. She knew her family was old. Her mother used to tell her stories of ancestors who could sing to the trees and soothe wild beasts, but she had always dismissed them as children's tales. Fanciful stories told to a noble girl in a stone castle. They were not real. They could not be real. Alistair saw the dawning horror on her face. He saw that she was beginning to understand. The final, cruelest twist of fate was about to be revealed. "The power to stop the blight," he said, his voice barely a whisper, each word a hammer blow against her shattered soul. "It resides only in the daughters of the Thorn lineage. It resides in you, Seraphina." The world tilted. The crackling fire, the dark trees, the face of the man before her. It all blurred into a swirl of incomprehensible noise and light. The moonstone amulet around her neck suddenly felt heavy, a dead weight against her chest. The betrothal gift from the man who had exiled her, a symbol of a love that was a lie, a relic of a bloodline he had deemed a weakness. And now that same bloodline was his only hope. The pain inside her was no longer a dull ache. It was a searing, white-hot agony that consumed everything. Her anger was gone. Her grief was gone. All that remained was the hollow echo of a cosmic joke. The man who had taken her life, her name, and her future had come to her on his knees, not to restore what he had broken, but to ask her to save him from his own ruin. He saw the utter devastation in her eyes, the way her spirit seemed to collapse inward. He took one last desperate step, his voice thick with the terrible weight of his own actions. Sarah stared at him, her face a mask of shattered disbelief as he said, "I destroyed you to save the kingdom, and now only you can save it." The world tilted on its axis. For a breath, there was only the cold point of her spear against his skin and the impossible weight of his words. "I destroyed you to save the kingdom, and now only you can save it." The silence that followed was immense, a vacuum where 3 years of hatred had just been erased and replaced with something hollow and far more terrible. Then, a sound tore from Seraphina's throat. It was not a scream or a sob. It was a laugh, a dry, splintering sound, like old wood cracking underfoot. It started low, a single broken note, then climbed into a cascade of cold, horrifying mirth that echoed through the silent trees. Alistair flinched, his cobalt eyes widening in confusion and shock. This was not the reaction he had anticipated. Not the rage, not the tears, not the dignified fury of the woman he once knew. This was the sound of a soul that had been pushed so far past pain, it had found a new, terrible clarity. The spear in Seraphina's hand wavered, then lowered, the sharp tips sinking harmlessly into the damp earth beside her. The strength to hold it, to threaten him, was gone, burned away by the sheer absurdity of his request. She laughed until tears streamed from her eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were the body's last resort when the mind could no longer process the cruelty of the world. Finally, the laughter subsided, leaving her gasping, her chest aching. She wiped her face with the back of a calloused hand, her emerald eyes locking onto his. The fire was gone from them. In its place was a landscape of ice, bent and unforgiving. "Save your kingdom," she whispered, the words raspy. "You want me to save your precious kingdom?" She took a step back, then another, putting distance between them as if he were the source of a disease. "Let it rot," she said, her voice gaining a venomous strength. "Let the blight take every last stone of Silverwood Keep. Let it wither every field and poison every stream. Let it drive every last one of your loyal wolves mad. I hope you are the last one standing, Alistair. I hope you get to watch it all turn to dust in your hands." His face, already etched with exhaustion, seemed to crumble. "Sarah, you don't understand what's at stake." "Oh, I understand perfectly," she snapped, her voice ringing with the clarity of absolute conviction. "You want the woman you cast out like garbage to come back and clean up your mess. The traitor you condemned is now the savior you need. The irony is so thick, I can taste it. It tastes like ash." She gestured wildly at the woods around them, at her small, crude shelter, at the fire pit where a single pot hung. "You think this was a holiday? You think I spent 3 years weaving flower crowns and singing to the birds?" Her voice dropped, becoming a low, trembling testament to her suffering. "The first winter I nearly perished. I didn't know how to build a proper shelter. I didn't know the difference between a root that would feed you and one that would kill you. I huddled in a hollow log while the snow piled up, my fingers and toes numb, certain I would not see the morning. I thought of you, in your warm keep, by your roaring fire. Did your seers ever tell you that? Did they tell you how I wept until my throat was raw and my tears froze on my face?" Alistair stood motionless, a statue carved from guilt. He made no move to interrupt, his expression a mask of torment as he absorbed every word. She was not shouting anymore. She was dissecting her own past, laying the pieces out for him to see. "I learned," she continued, her gaze turning inward. "I learned because I had to. I learned which berries were safe by watching the foxes. I learned to set snares, my hands shaking so badly I could barely tie the knots. The first rabbit I caught, I cried for an hour before I could bring myself to skin it. The noble lady Seraphina Thorne, weeping over a rabbit while she starved." She held up her hands, showing him her palms. They were no longer the soft, pale hands of a noblewoman. They were crisscrossed with scars, the skin tough and stained with dirt. The nails were short and practical. These hands learned to gut a fish. They learned to sharpen a spear. They learned to fight off a starving wolf who wanted my kill more than I did. Every scar has a story, Alistair. This one, she pointed to the thin white line along her jaw, is from a fall. I was chasing a deer, slipped on wet moss, and my head hit a rock. I lay there for hours bleeding, convinced this was the end. Her voice thickened with unshed tears. But the loneliest part wasn't the hunger or the cold. It was the silence, the crushing, absolute silence. In the keep, there was always noise, music, laughter, the gossip of the court, the clatter of guards. Out here, there was only the wind and the sound of my own heart beating, a constant reminder that I was utterly alone. The person I was, the woman you were supposed to love, she died out here. She died in the cold, in the fear, in the loneliness. You didn't just exile me, you arranged for my murder and left it to the wilderness to finish the job. She looked at him then, and for the first time a flicker of the old Seraphina was in her eyes, a deep, profound hurt that went beyond anger. You speak of a prophecy of saving the kingdom. The only prophecy that mattered was the one you spoke over me in that throne room, the one where you called me a traitor and sentenced me to a living death. The kingdom believed you. My friends, my family, everyone I had ever known, they turned their backs. They let you cast me out. And you want me to save them? To save the people who whispered behind their hands as I was dragged away. Alistair took a hesitant step forward, his own hands clenched into fists at his sides. They were misled. I misled them. The blame is mine alone. The blame is yours, she agreed, her voice flat. But the consequences are theirs to bear. They made their choice when they chose to believe the ambitious alpha who promised them stability over the woman who had grown up beside them. They chose you, so let their king save them. She shook her head, a gesture of finality. I owe them nothing. I owe this kingdom nothing. It took everything from me. My home, my name, my future. It left me with nothing but this. She clutched the moonstone amulet at her throat, the cold stone of familiar, painful weight, a reminder of a love that was a lie. He visibly recoiled as if she had struck him. It wasn't a lie, Sarah, not all of it. Stop, she commanded, her voice sharp as broken glass. Do not speak to me of love. You don't know the meaning of the word. Love does not betray. Love does not condemn. Love does not build a throne on the ruins of another person's soul. She paced the small clearing like a caged animal, the raw energy of her pain too much to contain. You know what I learned out here, Alistair? I learned that this forest, this place you sent me to die, it's more honest than your court ever was. The wolf that stalks you doesn't pretend to be your friend. The winter that freezes you doesn't promise you warmth. The hunger in your belly is a simple, brutal truth. There are no lies in the Whispering Woods. There is only survival. She stopped and faced him again, her shoulders squared, her chin high. She was no longer the broken woman laughing in despair. She was a queen of her own desolate realm, a sovereign of shadow and silence. I survived you. I survived the betrayal. I survived the wilderness. I am not that delicate girl anymore. I am harder than the stones in that river and older than the trees on this mountain. And I will not be your tool. I will not be your salvation. This, she swept her arm around, encompassing the dense woods, the dark canopy, the scent of pine and damp earth. This is my home now. This is my kingdom. And you are trespassing. She turned her back on him completely, a gesture of profound dismissal. It was the ultimate act of defiance, a mirror of the moment he had turned his back on her pleas in the throne room. Now she was the one with the power. She was the one casting him out. Leave my territory, she said, her voice low and steady, carrying the weight of an unbreakable command. Go back to your dying world and face the consequences of your ambition. Do not seek me out again. Do not speak my name. As far as your kingdom is concerned, Seraphina Thorne is dead. Let her stay that way. She started walking towards her shelter, each step a deliberate severing of the last thread that connected her to her past. She did not look back. She would not give him the satisfaction. She would let him stand there in the ruins of his own making. The silence stretched, heavy and absolute. He would leave. He had to. She had left him no other choice. Just as she reached the animal hide flap that served as her door, his voice cut through the air, stopping her cold. It was not loud, not begging, but laced with a new, chilling urgency. It's too late. Seraphina froze, her hand hovering in the air. The blight has already reached the Whispering Woods. Your sanctuary is dying too. Alistair's words clung to her like frost long after he had gone. She had watched his broad back disappear into the twilight, his proud silhouette swallowed by the trees he claimed were dying. Seraphina stood there motionless, the cold night air doing nothing to quell the fire in her chest. She wanted to believe it was a lie, another manipulation, a desperate, cruel tactic to bend her to his will. The king who had built his throne on falsehoods was surely capable of one more. She told herself this again and again as she banked the fire for the night, her movements stiff and angry. The forest was her home. It was ancient and wild, and it had embraced her when the world of men had cast her out. It could not be dying. Sleep did not come. Every creak of a branch, every rustle of leaves was no longer a familiar comfort. It was a potential symptom, a death rattle. His warning had poisoned the very air she breathed. By the time the first gray light of dawn filtered through the canopy, Seraphina was already awake, her jaw tight with a dread she refused to name. She had to know. She had to see the lie for herself, to prove him wrong and cast his words from her mind forever. She grabbed her pack, a waterskin and her spear, and left her camp without a backward glance. She did not head towards the border where Alistair had entered. Instead, she pushed deeper into her own territory, towards the northern ridge, a place of old, gnarled oaks and deep shadows she had always found peaceful. The forest was as it always was for the first hour. The scent of damp earth and pine filled her lungs. A squirrel chattered angrily from a high branch, and the distant call of a hawk echoed through the trees. Relief began to unwind the knot in her stomach. He had lied. Of course he had lied. The thought was a bitter triumph. But as she climbed the gentle slope of the ridge, the familiar sounds began to thin. The bird song faded first, replaced by a strange humming silence that pressed in on her ears. The air grew heavy, thick with a scent that was both sour and sterile, like long-dead embers in something metallic. She crested the ridge and stopped. The sight before her stole the breath from her lungs. Below, in a shallow basin she knew should be thick with ferns and vibrant green moss, the world had turned to ash. The mighty oaks stood like skeletons, their bark a brittle, sickly gray. Their leaves, where they hadn't already fallen, were black and shriveled, crumbling into dust at the slightest breeze. The ground was not covered in soil, but in a carpet of what looked like black, oily sludge. It seemed to pulse with a faint, internal light, a sickening cousin to the healthy bioluminescence of the deep woods. There were no animal tracks, no insects, nothing. It was a patch of utter desolation, a wound carved into the heart of her world. Seraphina took a hesitant step forward, her boots sinking slightly into the black moss. It felt wrong, spongy and corrupt. She crouched, her fingers hovering over the substance. It smelled of decay and ozone. Alistair hadn't been lying. He had not been trying to manipulate her. The truth was far, far worse. The blight was real, and it was here. A wave of nausea and a cold, sharp fear unlike any she had felt during her 3 years of exile washed over her. This was not the fear of starvation or of a predator. This was the fear of a world ending. Her world. The sanctuary she had bled for, the home she had clawed out of nothing, was being eaten alive from the inside. The anger at Alistair was still there, a hot coal in her gut, but now it was crowded by a terrifying new reality. She knew she had to find Fenris. If anyone in this forest understood its deepest secrets and its gravest threats, it was him. The old wolf had found her during her first winter, a half-starved girl shivering in a hollow log, and had silently guided her. He taught her which plants were safe, how to read the wind, and how to move without a sound. He was more a part of the woods than any creature she knew. His den was miles away, deep in the oldest part of the forest, a place the blighted patch was creeping out toward. She turned and ran, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The image of the gray trees and the black moss was burned into her mind. It took her the rest of the day, moving at a relentless pace, to reach the ancient groves where Fenris dwelled. The forest here was still healthy, with giant trees whose canopies formed a cathedral ceiling high above. She found him not at his den, but standing at the edge of a stream, staring back in the direction she had come from. He was in his human form, something she had only seen a handful of times. He was a tall, gaunt man, with wild gray hair that fell past his shoulders and skin creased like old leather. His amber eyes, usually filled with a calm, patient wisdom, were clouded with a deep, unsettling disturbance. He turned his head slowly as she approached, his gaze heavy. "You saw it," he said. It was not a question. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble, like stones grinding together. Seraphina could only nod, her throat tight. "Fenris, what is it?" "The king, he called it, the blight." Fenris looked at the clear, running water of the stream, as if trying to memorize it. "The name is as good as any. It is not a sickness of the earth, little hawk. It is not drought or disease. It is a wrongness." He lifted a hand and pointed a long, bony finger back toward the blighted ridge. "Nature can be cruel, but it is always honest. A fire burns, and new life grows from the ashes. A predator kills, and the herd grows stronger. That," he said, his voice dropping lower, "is a lie. It does not kill to make way for new life. It consumes, it erases. It leaves nothing behind but a shadow of what was." Sarah sank down onto a moss-covered rock, the strength leaving her legs. "The king said it drives the wolves mad." It twists everything it touches, Fenris confirmed, his eyes hardening. It finds the heart of a thing and turns it against itself. The strength of the wolf becomes mindless rage. The life of the tree becomes brittle dust. The fertility of the soil becomes a poison. It is a hunger that cannot be filled, an emptiness that seeks to spread. He finally looked at her, his expression grim. It will not stop at a ridge. It will take this stream. It will take these trees. It will take the dens, the burrows, the nests. It will take everything. And it will take us. His words fell into the quiet grove with the weight of prophecy. This was not a problem Alistair could solve with armies and politics. This was an enemy that defied all the laws of the world she knew. It was an existential threat, an unraveling of reality itself. A cold dread settled deep in her bones. She had spent 3 years learning the rules of survival in this forest, only to be confronted by something that did not play by any rules at all. "What do we do?" she whispered, the question sounding childish and small. Fenris was silent for a long moment. "For now, we watch, and we prepare. This evil is not of the forest. It was brought here, and it brings its own hunters." He looked up at the sky, where the sun was beginning to set, painting the clouds in shades of orange and blood red. "Be on your guard tonight, Seraphina. The silence you felt on that ridge is spreading, and things born of that silence are beginning to stir." She returned to her camp as darkness fell, Fenris's warning echoing in her mind. The familiar clearing no longer felt safe. It felt exposed, vulnerable. She built up the fire, the flames crackling higher than usual, casting dancing shadows that seemed to mock her. She sat with her back against a thick tree, her spear across her lap, her eyes scanning the deep darkness beyond the firelight. The normal chorus of the night was gone. There were no crickets, no hooting owls, no distant howls of a healthy pack. There was only the sound of the fire and the whisper of the wind, a wind that felt colder than it should. Her senses, honed by years of solitude, were screaming. Every nerve was on fire. The hair on her arms stood on end. She could feel it before she could see or hear it. A presence, multiple presences. They were moving through the woods with a single-minded purpose, their energy a discordant shriek against the natural harmony of the forest. It was the same corrupt wrongness she had felt from the blighted ground, but now it was alive, and it was hunting. They burst from the darkness without a sound, not a howl, not a growl, just the sudden crash of bodies moving through the undergrowth. There were at least 6 of them. At first she thought they were wolves, but they were horribly wrong. They were gaunt, their fur patchy and matted. Their bodies were laced with thick black veins that pulsed with a faint, sickly red light, visible even in the gloom. Their eyes glowed with that same malevolent crimson, devoid of any intelligence or spirit. There was only a ravenous, frenzied hunger. Seraphina was on her feet in an instant, the spear feeling impossibly light in her hands. One of the creatures lunged, and she pivoted, driving the sharpened point deep into its shoulder. A normal wolf would have yelped, would have recoiled in pain. This thing barely seemed to notice. It just twisted its head, jaws snapping wildly, trying to tear at her arm. It was unnaturally strong. She kicked it away, wrenching her spear free as it stumbled back. The fight was a blur of chaos. They were not like any animal she had ever fought. They did not use pack tactics. They did not try to flank or intimidate. They were a wave of mindless violence, throwing themselves at her with no regard for their own safety. She stabbed and slashed, her movements a desperate dance of survival. She dodged a lunge and sent one sprawling into the fire. It writhed and snapped, the flames catching on its dry fur, but it did not scream. It only continued to crawl towards her, a burning effigy of hatred. Another one charged from her blind spot. She felt a searing pain as its claws raked across her back, tearing through her leather tunic. She cried out, spinning and driving the butt of her spear into its face with a sickening crunch. The creature fell, but 2 more were already on her. They were relentless, tireless. She was breathing in ragged gasps, her muscles burning with effort. She managed to impale another through the chest, pinning it to the ground, but its legs still kicked and churned. She was losing. There were too many. She stumbled back, her foot catching on a root, and fell hard. Her spear flew from her grasp, skittering into the darkness. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her adrenaline. She scrambled backward, her hands searching for a weapon, a rock, anything. The remaining blighted wolves circled her, their red eyes fixated on her, black saliva dripping from their jaws. They were closing in, a tightening ring of death. One of them, the largest of the pack, lowered its head and gathered itself. Its muscles bunched, the black veins on its haunches pulsing furiously. It was going to end it. Seraphina pressed herself against the rough bark of a massive oak tree at her back, her knife in her hand, knowing it would be useless. This was it. The forest that had saved her was now going to be her tomb, consumed by the very darkness Alistair had warned her about. Her life wasn't flashing before her eyes. There was only the snarling face of the monster, the stench of its corruption, and a profound, bitter regret. The creature lunged, a blur of gray fur and red eyes aiming straight for her throat. Time seemed to slow to a crawl. In that final, terrifying moment, a black tempest erupted from the side. An enormous shape, all coiled muscle and midnight fur, crashed into the blighted wolf with the force of a landslide. The sound of the impact was a brutal crack of bone. The attacker was a wolf, but one of immense size and power, its form radiating an aura of pure, undiluted authority. It threw the blighted creature aside as if it were a toy, its neck broken. The black wolf landed silently between Seraphina and the rest of the pack. It let out a low, rumbling growl that vibrated through the very ground, a sound of absolute command and lethal promise. The remaining blighted wolves hesitated, their mindless frenzy momentarily broken by the sheer presence of this new alpha. Seraphina stared, her heart hammering against her ribs, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. The wolf's fur was the color of jet, and as it turned its head just slightly, its eyes caught the firelight. They were a piercing, impossible cobalt blue. Her breath caught in her throat. As the blight wolf lunged, a black fury crashed into its side, saving her. It was Alistair in his powerful black wolf form. The world exploded in a blur of black fur and snarling fury. The blighted wolf, moments from tearing into Seraphina, was sent flying by a force of nature. It hit a thick pine with a sickening crack of bone and slumped to the ground, twitching. A massive black wolf stood over it, chest heaving, a low growl rumbling in its throat. Its eyes, burning with an impossible cobalt blue, locked onto hers. Alistair. There was no time for shock, no space for the tidal wave of hate that rose in her throat. Another creature, all mangy fur and dripping jaws, lunged from the shadows. Sarah scrambled to her feet, her hand-forged spear feeling like a familiar extension of her own arm. The black wolf, Alistair, spun to meet the new threat, but a third beast was already flanking him. Without a word, without a thought, she moved. Her body remembered a rhythm her mind had tried to bury for 3 long years. She thrust her spear low, hamstringing the wolf closing in on Alistair's side. It yelped and tumbled, and he was on it in a flash, his powerful jaws closing on its neck. The fight was chaos, a whirlwind of snapping teeth, flashing steel, and the foul, sweet scent of corruption. They fell into a pattern, a deadly dance they had not practiced in a lifetime that felt like yesterday. He was raw power, a tempest of claws and muscle that broke through the pack's frenzied charges. She was precision and cunning, her spear a silver dart that found every weakness, every exposed flank. He would draw 2 of them forward, a challenging roar shaking the trees, and she would slip through the undergrowth to strike from behind. She would drive one back toward the fire, using the light to blind it, and he would be there to meet it, a shadow of death. It was infuriating. It was horrifying. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to let him be overwhelmed, to let the blight consume the man who had ruined her life. But her body betrayed her. Her muscles, honed by years of solitude and survival, moved in perfect, agonizing sync with his. A blighted wolf dodged his lunge and came for her. Before its claws could find her, Alistair's body slammed into its side, giving her the single moment she needed to drive her spear point up and under its jaw. She ripped the weapon free as he tore into another. They were back to back, her leathers pressed against the heat of his thick fur. The world shrank to the snarling circle of red eyes that surrounded them. She could feel the vibration of his growls through her own spine. The scent of him, wolf and man and pine, and something that was just Alistair, filled her senses. It was the scent of stolen afternoons in the royal woods, of whispered secrets on a balcony overlooking the capital, of a promise of forever. Now it was just the smell of a truce born from desperation, and it made her want to scream. A memory surfaced, sharp and unwelcome. A sunlit training yard at Silverwood Keep. A younger Alistair laughing, his hair falling into his eyes as he disarmed her for the third time. He had taught her this stance. He had told her that two mates fighting as one were an unbreakable fortress. He had placed her back against his hands on her shoulders. "Never show them your back," he had said, his voice warm and close to her ear. "Unless it is to me, I will always be your shield." The memory was a shard of glass in her heart. She grit her teeth, her knuckles white on the shaft of her spear, and channeled her anguish into cold, efficient violence. The pack was thinning. There were only 4 left now, their frenzy growing as their numbers dwindled. They were more reckless, less coordinated. One lunged wildly and Alistair met it head-on, his weight crashing it to the forest floor. At the same time, Seraphina sidestepped another's clumsy attack, spun, and thrust her spear deep into its chest. She put her boot on its ribs for leverage and pulled her weapon free just as Alistair dispatched his own foe. 2 remained. They circled, hesitant now, their red eyes glowing with a malevolent but cowardly intelligence. Alistair let out a low growl, a challenge. He took a step forward, drawing their attention. It was a classic move, the one he always used to signal the final push. And her body, her treacherous body, knew exactly what to do. As the 2 remaining wolves focused on the larger threat, she darted to the right, a silent phantom moving along the edge of the firelight. She would take the one on the far side, leaving him the closer one. It was a strategy they had used a dozen times against training dummies and in sparring matches. She was almost in position when she saw it. A third wolf, one she had thought was down for good, was stirring. It was the one Alistair had first thrown against the tree. It dragged its broken hind legs, pulling itself forward with its front claws, a trail of dark, oily blood marking its path. Its eyes were fixed on Alistair's back. He was completely focused on the 2 enemies in front of him, his powerful body coiled to spring. He had not seen it. "Alistair!" Her voice was a raw crack in the night air. He turned his head at the sound of his name, his blue eyes finding hers for a fraction of a second. The confusion on his face was clear. But that fraction of a second was all it took. The wolf in front of him lunged. He reacted instantly, spinning to meet the attack, but his timing was off by a heartbeat. The other standing wolf saw the opening. It abandoned its cautious circling and charged, not at his front, but at his exposed side. Everything seemed to slow down. Seraphina saw the wolf with the broken legs give one last, desperate heave. She saw Alistair twist to avoid the first attacker. And she saw the second one, a wiry, gray-furred beast with black veins pulsing visibly on its snout, leap through the air. Alistair was off balance. He couldn't evade it. The wolf's jaws, dripping with black saliva, snapped shut on his left shoulder. A roar of pure agony tore from Alistair's throat, a sound unlike any she had ever heard from him. It was not the roar of an alpha, but the scream of an animal in mortal pain. He thrashed, his immense strength sending the gray wolf flying, but it was too late. The teeth had sunk deep. Seraphina didn't even remember moving. Her rage, her grief, her hatred all coalesced into a single point of murderous focus. She closed the distance in 2 long strides and drove her spear through the gray wolf's ribs, pinning it to the forest floor. It convulsed once and went still. The last conscious, blighted wolf, seeing its pack utterly destroyed, turned and fled into the darkness of the whispering woods, its whines fading into the night. Silence fell, heavy and suffocating. The only sounds were the crackle of the campfire and Alistair's ragged, pained breaths. He stood unsteadily for a moment, his massive black form trembling. Then, with a shudder that seemed to rack his entire body, he began to change. It was not the fluid, controlled shift of a powerful alpha. It was a ragged, agonizing process, bones cracking and reforming as he collapsed to his knees. When it was over, he was no longer a great wolf. He was just a man, naked and kneeling in the dirt, clutching a ruined shoulder. Seraphina stood frozen, her spear still in her hand, dripping with dark blood. She watched him, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. The Alpha King, the man who had commanded armies and held the fate of a kingdom in his hands, was shivering before her, utterly vulnerable. The firelight played across the hard lines of his body, the corded muscles of his back and arms, and the horrifying wound on his shoulder. It was worse than she could have imagined. 4 deep puncture wounds marred his skin, but there was surprisingly little blood. Instead, thin black lines, like spiderwebs of ink, were already spreading out from the bite. The flesh around them was turning a sickly, bruised gray. The blight, it was inside him now. He had saved her from the blight, only to be claimed by it. A bitter, cruel irony settled over her. Part of her, the wounded part that had nursed its hatred for 3 years in the dark, felt a grim satisfaction. This was justice. This was a fate he had earned. He lifted his head, and his cobalt eyes met hers. The arrogance was gone. The desperation she had seen earlier was gone. All that remained was pain and a raw, primal fear. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but only a choked gasp came out. He pushed himself to his feet, swaying precariously. He took one stumbling step towards her, his hand reaching out, not in aggression, but in a silent, desperate plea. Then his eyes rolled back in his head. His body went rigid. A violent tremor shook him from head to toe, far more severe than a simple shiver. It was a convulsion, a storm breaking inside him. His muscles locked, his back arching unnaturally. He fell hard onto the damp earth, landing on his uninjured side. The impact knocked the air from his lungs in a harsh groan. Seraphina watched, rooted to the spot, as the poison began its work. The black veins on his shoulder were no longer static lines. She could see them moving, creeping up his neck and down his chest like searching tendrils. His skin, where the veins touched it, seemed to darken and die. A flush of unnatural heat radiated from him, so intense she could feel it from several feet away. He was burning from the inside out. He began to shake again, his limbs jerking uncontrollably against the fallen leaves. Another low, guttural sound of agony was torn from his throat as his body was racked with another violent spasm. She should have felt triumphant. She should have turned her back and walked away, leaving him to the fate he had so callously dealt her. Let the forest he claimed was dying claim him first. But her feet would not move. Her gaze was locked on his tormented form. This was not the proud king who had condemned her. This was not the ruthless Alpha who had taken the throne. This was the man she had once loved, dying in the dirt at her feet, and in the deepest, most betrayed corner of her heart, a different kind of horror was taking root. He collapsed onto the damp earth, his body racked with violent shudders as the poison raced through him, consuming him in a dark, unrelenting fever. The metallic tang of blood mingled with the sour, unnatural scent of the blight. In the sudden quiet of the clearing, every sound was sharp and loud. A single leaf drifted down, scraping against bark, the crackle of the dying fire, and the awful, ragged sound of Alistair's breathing. He lay twisted on the damp earth, a fallen king on a throne of mud and roots. His body shuddered in violent, uncontrolled spasms. Black veins pulsed across the skin of his neck and face, a dark web spreading from the wound on his shoulder. Seraphina stood over him, her spear held loosely in one hand. Her own breath came in ragged bursts, her muscles screaming with exhaustion from the fight. A vicious satisfaction coiled in her stomach. This was justice. This was the universe balancing its scales. The man who had thrown her to the wolves was now being consumed by a sickness born of shadow and madness. He had taken her life, her name, her future. Now the forest she called home was taking his. She should feel triumphant. She should turn her back, walk to her shelter, and wait for the forest to fall silent once more. He was dying, on her land. Good. The thought was cold and clear in her mind. Let him die. Let the ambitious king who built his throne on her ruin be erased. She remembered his voice in the throne room, ringing with false conviction as he declared her a traitor. She remembered the faces of the court, people she had known her whole life, turning away from her. The slam of the great gates of Silverwood Keep behind her was a sound that still echoed in her nightmares. He had done this. He had authored every moment of her suffering for the last 3 years. Alistair's body arched in a brutal convulsion, a strangled gasp tearing from his throat. It was not the sound of a king. It was the sound of an animal caught in a trap, a sound of pure, mindless agony. His eyes, those brilliant cobalt blue eyes that had once looked at her with such adoration, were now wide and unfocused, glazed with fever and terror. The black veins on his shoulder pulsed, thick and swollen, like worms crawling beneath his skin. The poison was moving, racing toward his heart. Seraphina's fingers tightened on her spear. Walk away, just walk away. Her mind screamed the command. He was a monster wearing the face of a man she had once loved. Letting him perish was not an act of cruelty. It was a simple consequence, as natural as a tree falling in a storm. He had summoned this storm himself, but her feet remained planted on the ground. Her eyes were fixed on the tremor running through his hand, his knuckles white as he clawed at the dirt. She remembered training with him in the castle courtyard. They were young, their futures stretching before them like a sunlit road. He had been teaching her a disarming move, his large hands guiding her wrists. His touch had been firm, but gentle. He had smelled of leather and clean wind. He had laughed when she finally twisted the practice sword from his grasp, a deep, genuine laugh that made her heart leap. Where was that man now? Was any piece of him left beneath the ambition and the guilt? Another spasm seized him, more violent than the last. His teeth clenched, and a low moan escaped his lips, a sound of such profound suffering that it bypassed her anger and struck something deeper, something old and buried. It was the instinct of a healer seeing a wound, of a packmate seeing another fall. It was an infuriating, unwelcome surge of empathy that she had tried so hard to kill. She hated him for it. She hated him for making her feel this, for making her care even now at the very end. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, unwilling drumbeat. It was not his life she wanted to save. She told herself that fiercely. It was the thought of him dying like this, alone and in agony, consumed by the very darkness he had sought her help to fight. It was a pathetic, ugly end. It was a waste. And if he died, the secret of his confession died with him. No one would ever know she was innocent. She would forever be the traitor who fled into the woods. The kingdom, her kingdom, would fall to the blight, and her name would be a curse on its dying breath. With a growl of frustration that was half sob, she dropped her spear. The weapon clattered against the stone, the sound swallowed by the oppressive silence. She fell to her knees beside him, the damp soil soaking through the worn leather of her trousers. Her hands hovered over the ragged, black-edged wound on his shoulder. The heat coming off his skin was like a furnace, but beneath it, there was an unnatural coldness emanating from the bite itself. It was the cold of the grave. What was she doing? She had no herbs for this, no knowledge to combat such a potent, magical poison. Fenris had told her the blight was an unnatural evil. It could not be fought with simple poultices and woodland remedies. Touching it was probably a death sentence. Still her hand moved, compelled by a force she did not understand. A desperate, foolish impulse to simply do something, to not just stand there and watch him be erased. As her fingers brushed against the torn edge of his tunic, the moonstone amulet tucked beneath her own shirt suddenly grew intensely cold, then searingly hot. A sharp gasp escaped her as the heat spread from her chest, a burning current racing down her arm. She tried to pull back, but her hand seemed to have a will of its own. She pressed her palm flat against the fever-hot skin over his wound. The world went white. A soft silver light erupted from the amulet, so bright it was blinding. It did not shine outwards but flowed inwards, channeling itself through her body, down her arm, and into her palm. Seraphina cried out, a sound of shock and pain, as the power surged through her. It felt like a river of liquid moonlight pouring through her veins, scouring her from the inside out. The light pulsed from her hand, sinking into Alistair's flesh. Beneath her palm, the angry black veins writhed. They fought against the silver light, coiling and twisting like dying snakes. The light was not burning them away, it was cleansing them, pushing them back. The dark infection receded from the edges of the wound, retreating slowly, stubbornly. It was a silent, desperate battle being waged in his very blood, a war between silver light and creeping shadow. Seraphina could feel the struggle as a painful vibration that traveled all the way up to her shoulder. Alistair's convulsions stopped. His body went slack, the terrible tension draining out of him. A long, shuddering sigh escaped his lips, a sound of release. The black lines that had reached his jawline and temple slowly faded, retreating back toward their source at the wound. They did not disappear entirely. The bite mark itself remained a festering, ugly thing, and the dark veins were still thick and coiled around his shoulder and upper arm. But they were contained. The immediate threat to his heart seemed to have passed. The flow of energy from the amulet began to wane. The intense light softened, the power receding from her veins, leaving behind a profound exhaustion and a strange, tingling emptiness. The silver glow under her palm flickered, then vanished. Her hand fell away from his shoulder as if it weighed 100 pounds. She stared at it, her fingers trembling. There was nothing different about it. It was just her hand, calloused and stained with dirt. But she had felt it, the power, the light. Slowly she lifted her gaze to Alistair's face. His eyes were open. They were clear. And they were fixed on her with an expression of pure, unadulterated shock. The fever haze was gone, replaced by a dawning, breathtaking understanding. He looked from her face to her hand and then to the moonstone amulet, which now lay dormant against her chest, its milky surface cool once more. The silence in the clearing stretched for an eternity, thick with unspoken questions. The legends of her bloodline, the stories her grandmother used to tell her about their ancestors, stories of healing light and a connection to the life force of the land. She had always dismissed them as children's tales, as myths to bolster a noble family's pride. But she had just felt it. It was not a story. It was a fire in her own blood. Alistair tried to push himself up on one elbow, his arms shaking with weakness. He winced, his gaze falling to his wounded shoulder, where the blight was now held in a fragile truce. He looked back at her, his blue eyes wide with an emotion she could not name. It was more than gratitude. It was awe. It was as if he was seeing her for the first time, not as the woman he betrayed, but as something more, something powerful and essential that he had carelessly thrown away. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a dry, rasping sound came out. He swallowed hard, his throat working. He tried again, his voice a raw whisper that barely disturbed the air between them. The magic, he rasped, his eyes locked on hers, reflecting the faint light of the moon. It's real. The silver light had vanished, but an echo of it remained, a phantom warmth on Seraphina's palm. Alistair stared at her, his cobalt eyes wide with an emotion she couldn't name. It was more than awe. It was the terrified reverence of a man witnessing a power he had dismissed as folklore. The black veins on his shoulder had retreated, no longer a spider web of death, but a dark, ugly bruise. He was still weak, his breathing ragged, but the fever that had threatened to consume him had broken. The magic, he rasped, the words scratching his throat. It's real. Seraphina pulled her hand back as if his skin had burned her. She looked at her own fingers, half expecting them to still be glowing. They were just fingers, calloused and stained with dirt. But something inside her had shifted. A lock had clicked open in a room she never knew existed. The moonstone amulet rested coolly against her chest, no longer just a painful reminder, but a key. For 3 years she had survived on instinct and strength. Now she held a weapon she didn't understand. She got to her feet, the movement stiff. Her gaze swept from Alistair, pathetic and wounded on the floor of her hut, to the dark, silent forest beyond her door. Her sanctuary. The whispering woods. He had told her it was dying too, and she had seen the proof. The gray, brittle trees, the oily moss that choked the life from the earth. This place had been her refuge when the world of men had cast her out. It had taught her, hardened her, and sheltered her. She would not let it perish. I will go back with you, she said. The words tasted like ash. Her voice was flat, devoid of any warmth. Alistair pushed himself up on one elbow, his expression flickering with a desperate hope. Sarah, do not mistake this, she cut him off, her emerald eyes cold as winter frost. This is not for you. It is not for your kingdom, which left me to die without a second thought. I am doing this for this land, for the forests and the rivers that are being poisoned. You brought this plague to my door. I will simply see it removed." She held his gaze, letting him see the chasm that now existed between them. There was no forgiveness there. There was no rekindled affection. There was only a grim, bitter transaction. Her power for the life of the land. He seemed to understand. He slowly nodded, the movement costing him visible effort. "Whatever your reasons," he said, his voice low. "Thank you." Seraphina turned away, unable to look at the gratitude in his eyes. It felt like another lie, another manipulation she couldn't afford to fall for. "Get your strength back," she ordered, her back to him. "We leave at dawn." The journey back to Silverwood Keep was a slow, agonizing pilgrimage through a dying world. They left the deep shadow quiet of the whispering woods behind, emerging into a landscape bleached of its color and vitality. The sun was a pale, watery disk in a hazy sky. A constant, faint smell of rotten dust hung in the air, catching in the back of the throat. Alistair, still recovering from the blight wound, walked with a slight limp, his usual commanding presence replaced by a grim, weary silence. Seraphina walked ahead of him, her spear in hand, her senses on high alert. But the dangers here were not the wild animals of the forest. The danger was the creeping, silent decay. They passed farmlands where stalks of wheat stood brittle and black, crumbling to dust at a touch. The fields were not empty. Farmers and their families stood staring at the ruin of their livelihoods, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollow with a despair that went deeper than hunger. They looked like ghosts haunting their own homes. Sarah saw a little girl, no older than 7, sitting on the steps of a small cottage. She was cradling a wooden doll, but her eyes were fixed on a chicken lying motionless in the dirt yard, its feathers dull, its body unnaturally still. The child wasn't crying, she was just watching, as if learning a final, terrible lesson about the world. The sight twisted something deep in Seraphina's gut. In her 3 years of exile, her world had shrunk to the size of her own survival. Her pain was the only pain, her hunger the only hunger. Now the suffering of her people was laid bare before her. These were the faces Alistair had claimed to be protecting when he cast her out. He had traded her life for theirs, and in the end, he had failed them all. She glanced back at him. He was watching the family too, his jaw tight, a muscle twitching in his cheek. The guilt on his face was stark and ugly. He looked away, meeting her gaze for only a second before his eyes fell to the blighted ground. He said nothing. There was nothing he could say that would fix this. They traveled for 2 days, speaking little. The silence was a heavy blanket woven with shared history and bitter resentment. At night, they made a small, smokeless fire. Sarah would treat his wound, her touch clinical and detached as she applied a poultice of herbs. She could feel the faint thrum of magic under her skin, a low hum that wanted to answer the darkness in his injury, but she held it back. She had stabilized him. That was enough. He tried to speak to her once as they sat across the fire. "The court. They won't understand," he began, his voice hesitant. "They will see you and remember only the accusations." "Let them," Seraphina replied without looking up from sharpening her knife. "I am not returning for their approval. I am returning to find the source of this rot. Their opinions are less than meaningless to me." His face tightened. He had expected fear, perhaps, or a request for his protection. He had not expected this cold, unshakable indifference. The woman he had sent into the wilderness was gone. In her place was someone he did not know at all, someone forged in the crucible of his own making. On the third day, the imposing silhouette of Silverwood Keep rose from the horizon. The fortress of gray stone and dark timber stood against the sick sky, its towers like jagged teeth. From a distance, it looked the same, the symbol of Blackwood power, unbreachable and eternal. But as they drew closer, she saw the subtle signs of decay. The great banners of the clans hung limp and faded, stained by an unnaturally acidic rain. The guards on the battlements moved with a sluggish weariness, their armor seeming too heavy for them. The vibrant energy of the capital city that surrounded the keep was gone, replaced by a tense, fearful quiet. As they approached the main gate, 2 guards stepped forward. Their spears crossed to bar the way. Their eyes widened when they recognized the king. Then their gazes shifted to Seraphina. and their face hardened with suspicion and contempt. "My king," one of the guards said, his voice rough, "you have returned. But who is this with you?" He knew exactly who she was. The question was an insult, a challenge. Alistair drew himself up, a flicker of his old authority returning. "This is Lady Seraphina," he announced, his voice ringing with a command he didn't feel. "She returns at my invitation. Open the gates." The guards exchanged a nervous look, but the habit of obedience was too deeply ingrained. They lowered their spears and heaved the massive wooden gates open. The screech of the hinges echoed in the unnatural silence of the courtyard. Walking through those gates was like stepping back into a nightmare. This was the place where her life had been torn apart. Every stone held a memory. The courtyard where she had trained with Alistair, their laughter echoing as wooden swords clashed. The balcony where he had given her the moonstone amulet, his fingers warm on her skin as he fastened the clasp. The great hall where he had stood before the entire court and declared her a traitor. Her heart began to pound, a frantic, trapped bird against her ribs. Her hand instinctively went to the hilt of the knife at her belt. The air inside the keep was cold and stagnant. It smelled of beeswax and old stone, but underneath was the same faint scent of decay she had noticed in the farmlands, clinging to the tapestries and the polished floors like a shroud. Word of their arrival spread like wildfire. Servants peered from doorways, their eyes wide with shock and fear. Nobles milling in the corridors stopped dead, their conversations dying in their throats. Whispers followed them like rustling leaves. The traitor. What is she doing here? Has the king gone mad? Seraphina kept her head high, her face an unreadable mask. She focused on the feel of the worn leather grip of her spear, the solid weight of it in her hand. It was a piece of her new life, a reminder that she was not the same woman who had been dragged from this hall in tears. She met their hostile stares with an unnerving calm. Let them stare. Let them whisper. They were afraid of a dying world. She had already learned to live in one. Alistair led her directly to the throne room. He needed to make this official, to present her return as an act of royal decree. The great hall was already filling with members of the court, drawn by the commotion. They parted before the king, a sea of silks and velvets, their faces a mixture of confusion and open hostility. At the foot of the dais where the throne sat, a man stepped forward, Lord Valerius Croft. Alistair's most trusted advisor, his second in command, Seraphina remembered him well. A man with thinning gray hair, cold, calculating eyes, and a smile that never reached them. He had always looked at her with a thinly veiled condescension, even when she was Alistair's betrothed. Now his expression was one of profound theatrical disappointment. "My king," Valerius said, his voice smooth as oil, yet carrying to every corner of the silent hall. "You have returned." We were growing gravely concerned. His gaze slid to Seraphina, and a contemptuous sneer briefly twisted his lips. "But you have brought an unwelcome ghost back with you." Alistair's face was pale, but his voice was firm. "Lord Valerius, Lady Seraphina is here by my command. She is essential to the survival of this kingdom." Valerius let out a soft, incredulous laugh. It was a sound designed to sow doubt, to mock the king's authority in front of his subjects. "Essential?" he repeated, turning slightly to address the assembled nobles. "My lords, my ladies, we all remember the crimes this woman was exiled for. She conspired with our enemies. She betrayed our trust. Her exile was a matter of justice, a necessity to secure our kingdom under a strong alpha king." He took a step closer to Alistair, his voice dropping to a tone of feigned, sincere counsel. "My king, I understand you are under immense pressure. The blight tests us all, but in times of crisis, we must show strength, not weakness. We must rely on loyal subjects, not consort with convicted traitors." His eyes locked onto Seraphina, dripping with venom. "Her presence here is a stain on this court. It is an insult to every man and woman who has remained loyal." "That is enough, Valerius," Alistair snapped, his voice cracking with strain. "You do not understand the situation." "Oh, I believe I understand it perfectly," Valerius countered, his voice rising again, sharp and clear for all to hear. He pointed a long, accusing finger at Seraphina. "You were weak enough to be deceived by her once. And now, in our darkest hour, you have brought the source of our past troubles back into our home, hoping she will be our salvation." He turned his back on Alistair, facing the court directly, his arms spread wide in a gesture of shared outrage. He was no longer advising, he was leading a rebellion. "This is not leadership," he declared, his voice ringing with righteous fury. "This is desperation. This is madness." Valerius's cold gray eyes swept across the room, landing on every uncertain face, fueling their fear. He then fixed his gaze back on his king, his expression one of cold, hard certainty. In front of the entire court, Valerius challenged Alistair's judgment, declaring that bringing Seraphina back is a weakness that will doom them all. Lord Valerius's words hung sharp and cold in the throne room. A murmur of fear and opportunity rippled through the court. Alistair's jaw was set like stone, but Seraphina was not watching him. She scanned the faces of the lords who had watched her fall, their opinions now less than dust. While the two alphas postured, she simply turned and slipped into the shadows at the edge of the hall. No one noticed her go. They were watching a game she no longer intended to play. The castle was a ghost, and every corridor echoed with memories she had fought to bury. Here was the alcove of a stolen kiss. There, the staircase where her father had smiled with pride. Now the tapestries of her family's victories seemed to mock her. The air, thick with beeswax and polished steel, was the scent of her former cage. She avoided the main halls, her feet finding a path to a forgotten wing. Her fingers, scarred from the wild, traced the outline of a loose stone in the wall. It was a secret from her childhood, a map to the keep's hidden heart. The stone groaned aside, revealing a dark, narrow opening that exhaled a musty draft. She slipped inside, pulling the stone shut behind her. The click was a final severing. In the familiar dark, she ran a hand along the rough-hewn wall, her memory her only guide. The passage sloped down into the foundations, the silence broken only by her soft boots in a distant drip of water. This was the castle she truly knew, the place where truth could hide. Her destination was a room not on any map, the Scriptorium Umbra. It held the failures, the dark bargains, and the forbidden knowledge of her bloodline. She found the simple ironwood door and pressed a sequence of stones above it. A low click echoed and the heavy door swung inward. A single moonbeam cut through the dust, illuminating a circular room lined with countless scrolls. The air smelled of ancient parchment and faded ink. There was no time to waste. Alistair thought the blight was a natural disaster. Her instincts screamed it was a poison, and poisons always have a source. She began her search, her eyes scanning the faded tags on each scroll case. She ignored the histories of wars and kings, looking for older words of power and ritual. Hours passed. Desperation began to creep in. She pushed the thought away. The forest had taught her patience. You wait, you watch, you listen. A tag of dark, volcanic glass finally caught her eye. It hung from a scorched oak case, tucked away near the floor. The inscription was in a dead dialect, but she recognized the symbol. It was a broken serpent eating its own tail, releasing a black vapor. Her heart began to beat a slow, heavy drum. She carried the case into the light and opened it. The scroll inside was not parchment, but cured wyvern hide. The ink a deep, unsettling crimson. The title read, "The Ritual of Ascendancy." It was a forbidden rite for an alpha to forcibly bind the spirit of the land to their will. It promised to elevate a claimant to the status of a king, a shortcut to the throne. Her hands trembled as she read the components. A celestial alignment that happened only once every 50 years. A circle of obsidian shards, an offering of blood, a chant to subjugate the earth. It was chillingly familiar. Alistair had confessed to a powerful ritual to solidify his claim, one based on a prophecy he now knew was false. Then she reached the final section, a warning in a frantic hand. It spoke of immense danger. If the Alpha's will was not absolute, if their heart held selfish ambition, the ritual would shatter. The power drawn from the land would not be absorbed. It would turn into a necrotic poison. The scroll described a creeping decay, a shadow corruption that withered plants and drove creatures to a black-veined madness. A plague that would not stop until it consumed the very land that birthed it. The scroll called it the Blight, The wyvern skin slipped from her fingers. The room spun. It was all there. Alistair had not just misinterpreted a prophecy. He had stood in a circle of obsidian, spoken the words, and unleashed this hell upon their world. The prophecy was a lie, a lure to perform the one ritual that could destroy everything. The pain that lanced through her was not for her own betrayal. It was a vast, cold horror. His pride had a price, and the entire kingdom was paying it. She snatched the scroll from the floor and ran. She burst from the scriptorium, her boots pounding on the stone floors of the main keep. Servants stared as a wild-eyed wraith with silver hair flew past, a dark scroll clutched in her fist. She saw only Alistair's face, the face of the man who had broken their world. The doors to the royal council chamber were closed. She did not slow. She threw her shoulder against the heavy oak, and the doors crashed open with a deafening boom. Every head in the room snapped towards her. Alistair stood at the head of the table, his face a mask of thunder, clearly reprimanding Lord Valerius. The council stared in stunned silence. "Seraphina," Alistair began, his voice a low growl of warning. "This is not the time." "Not the time," her voice cracked through the quiet. "You have been king for 3 years, Alistair. When exactly would be the time to discuss how you murdered our kingdom?" She strode forward, ignoring the shocked gasps. She slammed the ancient scroll down on the polished wood in front of him. "Do you recognize this?" she demanded, her voice shaking with rage. "It's called the Ritual of Ascendancy, a shortcut for an alpha too impatient to earn his throne." Alistair stared at the scroll, the color draining from his face. His eyes were wide with a dawning, sickening comprehension. Seraphina's finger jabbed the text. "It speaks of a circle of obsidian, a celestial alignment from 3 years ago, a chant to subjugate the earth. Does any of this sound familiar to you, Your Majesty?" He could not speak. He could only stare at the words. "You told me you misinterpreted a prophecy," she continued, her voice a venomous whisper. "You lied. You were fed poison, and you swallowed it whole because you were so desperate for power. This was not a mistake. This was a choice." She straightened, her emerald eyes boring into his. "The warning is right here, Alistair. It says if the Alpha's heart is not pure, the ritual shatters. The power corrupts. It creates a plague, a blight that will consume everything." She took a deep breath, her voice ringing with terrible weight. "You did not find the blight. You made it. Every withered leaf, every starving family, every sick wolf, that is all your creation." The truth struck him like a physical blow. The walls of his pride and justification crumbled to dust. He was not a flawed king trying to save his people. He was the architect of their doom. The unbearable weight crushed him, his face crumpling into a mask of pure horror and self-loathing. Just as a choked, agonized sound escaped Alistair's lips, the great chamber doors burst fully open with a violent crash. The air in the council chamber was thick with the dust of ages and the fresh poison of revelation. Alistair's face was a ruin, his grand authority collapsing into the hollow eyes of a man staring into his own abyss. Seraphina held the scroll like a weapon, its brittle edges digging into her fingers. The silence was absolute, a vacuum waiting for the world to crack. Then the great oak doors crashed open, splintering the moment into 1,000 sharp pieces. Lord Valerius Croft stood framed in the doorway. Behind him, a dozen of his personal guard filled the hall, their steel armor glinting in the torchlight, their faces impassive stone. Valerius himself wore a look of grave concern, a mask so poorly fitted it barely concealed the triumphant smirk beneath. His cold gray eyes swept the room, taking in the scene with an almost hungry satisfaction. He saw the damning scroll in Seraphina's hand. He saw the shattered king on the verge of collapse. He saw his victory. "My king," Valerius said, his voice a smooth, dangerous syrup poured over the raw tension. He strode into the chamber, his steps echoing with an unnerving confidence. His guards followed, forming a silent, intimidating wall that cut off the room from the rest of the keep. "I heard shouting. I came as quickly as I could. It seems I find you distressed." Alistair did not answer. He couldn't. His gaze was fixed on the ancient text Seraphina held, the words swimming before him, each character a testament to his own monumental failure. He had built his reign on a lie, and that lie had birthed a monster. The kingdom was dying because of him. The truth was a physical weight, crushing the air from his lungs, pinning him in place. Seraphina watched Valerius, her mind racing. The timing was too perfect. This was no concerned subordinate stumbling upon a crisis. This was an ambush. The wolf had been waiting for the alpha to bleed. Her grip on the scroll tightened. Every instinct she had honed in the whispering woods screamed at her. The true predator was not the broken man before her, but the one circling them now. Valerius's eyes flicked from Alistair's vacant stare to Seraphina's defiant one. "And Lady Seraphina," he purred, a slow smile finally breaking through his facade. "Returned from exile. How unexpected. It appears your presence brings with it a certain chaos, just as it always did." He took another step, his gaze dropping to the scroll. "What fascinating artifact have you brought to upset our king so?" Seraphina held it up slightly. "The truth," she said, her voice low and hard, "something this court has been lacking for years." Valerius laughed, a soft, condescending chuckle that grated on the nerves of Brahm. "The truth, my dear lady, truth is a matter of perspective. And from my perspective," he gestured to Alistair, "I see a king who has lost his way. A king who conspired with a known traitor, brought her back into our very midst, and now stands paralyzed while our lands wither and our people suffer." He turned to address the room, though only the three of them and his guards were present. His voice boomed with theatrical authority. "I see a king who is no longer fit to rule." The words hung in the air, a formal declaration of war. Alistair finally flinched, his head snapping up. A flicker of his old fire returned to his eyes, a spark of defiance against the man who had been his most trusted advisor. "Valerius," he growled, his voice rough with despair. "You dare." "I dare because it is my duty," Valerius replied, his face hardening into a mask of righteous resolve. "Your ambition has blinded you, Alistair. You were so eager to seize the throne, you grasped at any prophecy that promised you glory. You never stopped to question its source." A cold dread began to creep up Seraphina's spine, a feeling worse than the hatred she'd felt for Alistair. She saw the path unfolding before he even laid the stones. "That prophecy," Valerius continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, yet loud enough to fill the cavernous room, "the one about a great leader who would unite the clans through a show of absolute strength? The one that whispered of a hidden weakness in the Thorn bloodline that must be purged for the kingdom to be strong?" He paused, letting the implications sink in. "I wrote it." Alistair stared, his face a canvas of dawning horror. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place, not with a satisfying snap, but with the sickening crunch of breaking bone. His betrayal of Seraphina, his ruthless consolidation of power, the dark ritual. It was all built on a foundation laid by another. He had been a puppet, and Valerius had been holding the strings. "You," Alistair breathed, the word barely audible. "Me," Valerius confirmed, his chest puffing out with pride. "I knew your pride, Alistair. I knew your hunger. It was so predictable. I gave you the perfect excuse to remove the only person who might have tempered your worst instincts. I gave you the justification to perform a ritual you were not worthy of. A ritual I knew would have unpredictable consequences." He gestured vaguely, as if the blight was a minor, regrettable side effect. "I needed a crisis, a disaster so profound that the people would cry out for a true savior. Someone with the strength and foresight to clean up the mess left by a failed, arrogant king." He spread his arms wide. "I planned for your failure. It was the entire point." The confession was so monstrous, so complete in its evil, that it left Seraphina breathless. For 3 years, her hatred had been a pure, focused thing, a black diamond aimed squarely at Alistair. Now that diamond shattered, the man she despised was a fool, a pawn in a game so vast and cruel it defied imagination. The true architect of her suffering, of the kingdom's suffering, was Valerius. Alistair made a guttural sound, a roar of pure anguish and rage, and lunged. But it was a broken, clumsy effort. He was a king in name only, stripped of his power by the weight of his own soul. Valerius didn't even flinch. He simply nodded. Two of his guards surged forward. They caught Alistair by the arms, their armored grips unyielding. The king struggled, his strength now just that of a desperate man, not an alpha. The guards slammed him to his knees on the cold stone floor. The sound echoed like a gavel, sealing a verdict. The reign of Alistair Blackwood was over. "You see," Valerius said to Seraphina, his voice calm again, "weakness, consumed by guilt, when he should be commanding. He is unfit. The kingdom needs a leader who is not afraid to make difficult choices, a leader who is not burdened by foolish sentiment." With Alistair subdued, Valerius turned his full attention to Seraphina. He walked toward her, his eyes fixed on the moonstone amulet at her throat. "And now we come to you, my lady, the missing piece, vai." Seraphina stood her ground, her body rigid, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was alone, trapped in a room with the man who had orchestrated her ruin and a dozen of his loyal soldiers. "I have been watching," Valerius said, his voice dropping low. "I have my own seers, you know, far more reliable than Alistair's. They told me of your bloodline's true potential, not a weakness to be purged, but a power to be harnessed, the power to cleanse, the power to control." He was so close now she could smell the faint scent of dried herbs and wine on his breath. "Alistair thought he needed to destroy you. The fool. He should have sought to control you." His gaze was intense, proprietary. It made her skin crawl. "This blight, it is a magnificent accident, a source of immense power, chaotic, yes, but chaos is a ladder. And with your ability, we can climb it together." He reached out, his fingers tracing the air just inches from her cheek. "Join me, Seraphina. Let this broken king rot in a dungeon. Let the world believe he was the sole author of this plague. We will emerge as the saviors. You will be my queen, not as a decorative wife, but as a true partner. Your magic will tame the blight, and my will shall direct it. We can reshape this kingdom, this world, into anything we desire. An empire built on power that no one can challenge." The offer was obscene. He was asking her to become a tyrant alongside him, using the very magic of her ancestors as a tool for domination. He wanted to weaponize her gift, to pervert the land's healing into a form of control. He saw the blight not as a wound to be healed, but as a resource to be exploited. For a moment, all she could feel was a white-hot fury. It burned away the shock, the fear, everything. She looked from Valerius's smug, expectant face to Alistair, kneeling on the floor, his head bowed in utter defeat. The man who had betrayed her was now betrayed himself, brought low by the same ambition Valerius had cultivated in him. There was no justice in it, only a deeper, more profound tragedy. Her gaze returned to Valerius. She thought of the blighted land she had traveled through, the sick animals, the desperate faces of the farmers, the gray trees that looked like skeletons reaching for a dead sky. She thought of Fenris and the sanctity of the woods that were now dying. Valerius saw all that pain and called it an opportunity. A bitter, cold laugh escaped her lips. It was not the broken sound she'd made in the forest when Alistair confessed. This was different. This was the laugh of someone who had seen the absolute depths of another's depravity and found it almost absurd. "You are a monster," she said, her voice quiet but carrying the weight of iron. Valerius's smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of irritation. "I am a pragmatist. Power is the only thing that matters, my dear. You, of all people, should understand that." "I understand that you poisoned everything," she shot back, her voice rising. "You poisoned Alistair's mind. You poisoned the land. And now you want to poison my soul." She took a small step back, her hand instinctively going to the amulet. "I will never help you." The refusal was absolute. There was no room for negotiation in her tone, no hint of hesitation. Valerius's face contorted, the mask of the charming manipulator finally melting away to reveal the snarling predator beneath. The syrupy smoothness of his voice vanished, replaced by a low, guttural growl. "Foolish girl, you think you have a choice." He laughed again, but this time it was a harsh, ugly sound devoid of any humor. It was the sound of a predator about to close its jaws. "I offered you a crown. You chose a cage. So be it." He snapped his fingers. "Take her," he commanded his guards. Two more men broke from the line, their heavy boots thudding on the stone as they advanced on her. Seraphina's mind went into overdrive. The door was blocked. She was outnumbered. Her only weapon was a brittle scroll and a magic she barely understood. The room felt like it was closing in, the torchlight shrinking, the shadows growing into monstrous shapes. Valerius leaned in close, his voice a venomous hiss in her ear. You will help me. You will be my key to unlocking the Blight's full potential. He glanced at the guards now flanking her, their hands reaching. Or you will watch as I feed this entire kingdom to the Blight, piece by piece, starting with everyone you ever cared about. You will watch it all burn, knowing you could have stopped it. The command hung in the air, thick and final. Take her. For a heartbeat, Seraphina was frozen. The same cold dread that had paralyzed her 3 years ago, threatening to lock her limbs. The faces of the guards, once familiar, were now masks of grim obedience. They advanced, their hands reaching for her. But this was not the same woman who had been dragged from the throne room in tears. The forest had burned that weakness away, replacing it with something hard and sharp. A single word formed in her mind, a vow forged in solitude and rage. No. Her hand flew to her throat, her fingers closing around the moonstone amulet. It was cold against her skin, a dead weight of memory. But as Valerius's men closed in, she did not feel the past. She felt a deep, humming well of power she had only just begun to understand. She pulled on it, not with grace or knowledge, but with raw, desperate will. The amulet flared. It did not glow softly as it had with Alistair. It erupted. A wave of pure silver light exploded from her chest, silent and blinding. The guards recoiled, crying out as if struck. The light was not hot, but it felt solid, a physical force that scrambled the senses and left a high-pitched ringing in their ears. Valerius shielded his eyes, his sneer twisting into a snarl of shock. In that moment of chaos, Seraphina moved. She shoved past a stunned guard, her shoulders striking him hard, and sprinted from the council chamber. She did not look back. Behind her, she heard Valerius roar her name, a sound of fury and thwarted ambition. The heavy wooden door slammed shut behind her, the sound echoing in the sudden, deafening silence of the stone corridor. Her heart hammered against her ribs, not with fear, but with the wild thrum of adrenaline. She was free. For now. Back in the chamber, Alistair watched the door slam. The image of Seraphina's defiant escape burned into his mind. The silver light had jolted him from his stupor of guilt. He saw Valerius, his face contorted with a madness that went far beyond political maneuvering. This was not about saving the kingdom. This was about devouring it. Valerius had orchestrated everything. The prophecy, the exile, the Blight itself. Alistair's ambition had been the key, but Valerius had forged it, turned it, and inserted it into the lock. Seize him, Valerius shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at the king. He is weak, a broken alpha who brought a traitor back to our hearth. The two guards holding Alistair tightened their grip, but the king they held was not the same man from moments ago. The self-loathing was still there, a cold pit in his stomach. Yet now it was fuel for a fire he had thought long extinguished. He saw Valerius not as a rival, but as a cancer, a corruption that had to be cut out. His blue eyes, clouded for so long with weariness, now blazed with cold cobalt fury. With a guttural roar that was more wolf than man, Alistair exploded. He wrenched his arms free, the strength of a true alpha snapping the guard's grips like twigs. He slammed an elbow into one man's jaw, sending him staggering back. He spun, grabbing the second guard by his armor and hurling him into two others who were rushing forward. Guards of the Blackwood! Alistair's voice boomed, cutting through the confusion. It was the voice of command, the voice that had led armies and held a kingdom together. Lord Valerius is the traitor. He confessed to creating the Blight. He has poisoned our lands and sought to usurp the throne. Your loyalty is to the crown, not to the viper who seeks to wear it. For a tense second, the room was divided. Valerius's personal guard drew their swords, their faces set and loyal only to their paymaster. Across from them, the royal sentinels, the men sworn to the keep itself, hesitated. They looked from the raging king to the sneering lord. They had seen the Blight's horror. They had heard Valerius's damning confession. One of the older guards, a captain with a scarred face named Thomas, met Alistair's eyes. He saw the truth there, the terrible, agonizing truth. With a sharp cry, Thomas drew his sword and stood with his king. "For the kingdom," he yelled. The choice was made. The council chamber erupted into a maelstrom of steel and shouting. It was not a battle, but a frantic, brutal skirmish. Alistair fought with the ferocity of a cornered wolf, his movements a blur of controlled violence. He was unarmed, but he was a weapon unto himself. He disarmed one of Valerius's men, the sword clattering on the stone floor, and used the man as a shield against another's attack. Valerius, seeing the tide turning, backed away towards a side door. His plans were crumbling. He had underestimated the loyalty Alistair still commanded, and he had fatally underestimated Seraphina. "Fools," he spat. "You fight for a dying world. I was offering you power." He slipped through the door, his guards fighting a desperate rearguard action to cover his escape. Alistair knew where he was going. The throne room. The scrolls had described the ritual's anchor, the place where the power had been drawn and where the blight was tethered to their world. He had to get to Seraphina. He had to help her. "To the throne room," he bellowed, breaking through the line of fighting. He cannot be allowed to finish what he started. The remaining loyal guards rallied to him, and the battle spilled out into the grand hallways of Silverwood Keep. The clash of swords echoed off tapestries depicting old victories, a bitter soundtrack to the kingdom's potential end. Seraphina ran. She knew these secret passages from childhood, the dusty, forgotten veins of the castle. Her bare feet made no sound on the cold stone. The air was stale, thick with the scent of ages. But another smell was beginning to creep in, a familiar, sickening odor of decay and wrongness. The blight. It was stronger here, deeper in the castle's heart. She followed the scent, her instincts screaming that it was a predator's trail. It led her upwards, towards the great hall, towards the throne room. She emerged from a hidden panel behind a tapestry, her hand clutching a small knife she'd kept hidden in her boot. The hallway was empty, but the sounds of fighting were distant now, muffled by stone and distance. Before her stood the immense carved oak doors of the throne room. They were slightly ajar. A faint, sickly green light pulsed from within, and the air that seeped out was cold enough to make her breath mist. Black, vein-like tendrils crept from beneath the doors, like dark roots grasping their way out. They pulsed with the same faint light, and she knew. Valerius was in there. She pushed the heavy door open. The room she had once known, a place of state and ceremony, was desecrated. The high, arched windows were dark, covered in a creeping black moss that seemed to drink the moonlight. The grand tapestries were discolored, their vibrant threads turned to shades of gray and black. And in the center of the room, where the great alpha throne of blackwood should have stood, was a vortex of dark energy. The throne itself was dissolving, its ancient wood and iron twisting and melting into a jagged altar of black, crystalline material. At its center pulsed a core of pure darkness, the heart of the blight. Lord Valerius knelt before it. He was chanting in a low, guttural language that made the stones vibrate. His arms were raised, and black energy flowed from the altar, wrapping around his hands, his arms, seeping into his very skin. The black veins she had seen on the blighted wolves were now crawling up his neck, pulsing on his face. He was not just controlling the blight. He was trying to merge with it, to become its living vessel. He was sacrificing the kingdom for ultimate power. "Valerius!" Her voice was sharp, cutting through his chant. He turned slowly. His eyes were no longer gray. They were solid black, pools of infinite hunger. When he smiled, it was a terrifying distortion of his usual condescending smirk. "Lady Seraphina," he hissed, his voice a layered chorus of his own and something ancient and terrible. "You are just in time to witness my ascension. Your power was the key, but my will shall be the master." He rose to his feet, and he seemed taller, his frame imbued with an unnatural strength. The floor around him was a spider web of black corruption. "You cannot stop this," he said, his voice echoing in the vast, dying room. "I am this world's Nuko." "You are a disease," Seraphina shot back, her knuckles white around the hilt of her small knife. The amulet at her neck grew warm, a steady, protective heat against her skin. "And I am the cure." She lunged, not with the blind rage of before, but with the calculated precision of a hunter. She did not aim for him, but for the corrupted altar. If she could break the focus of his ritual, Perhaps she could sever his connection. Valerius moved with impossible speed, intercepting her. He did not grab her. He swatted her aside with one arm, a casual display of immense power that sent her tumbling across the stone floor. Pain exploded in her shoulder as she hit the ground hard. The air was knocked from her lungs. He stalked towards her, the black veins on his skin glowing brighter. "You had your chance to stand with me. Now you will be the first sacrifice to my new reign." He raised his hand, and a tendril of pure shadow lashed out like a whip, aimed for her heart. Seraphina squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the impact. The blow never came. The sound of the throne room doors crashing open filled the chamber. Alistair stood there, his face pale and streaked with grime. A deep gash bled freely from his side, his hand pressed against it, his tunic soaked in crimson. Several of his loyal guards lay in the hallway behind him, overwhelmed on the path here. He was alone, and he was dying, but his eyes were fixed on Valerius, blazing with a final defiant fire. "Valerius!" he roared. Valerius turned, his concentration broken, the shadow whip dissolving into mist. His black eyes widened in fury at the interruption. "The broken king, come to watch your world end?" "I came," Alistair gasped, taking a staggering step forward, "to end you." The distraction was all Seraphina needed. She scrambled to her feet, ignoring the searing pain in her shoulder. She saw Alistair, wounded and swaying, and her heart clenched with a complicated agony of hate and something she refused to name. She saw Valerius, a monster of ambition and dark magic, and she saw her chance. Valerius laughed, a horrible grating sound. "You can barely stand. What can you possibly do?" He turned his full attention on Alistair, dismissing Seraphina as a threat. He gathered the dark energy again, forming a shard of jagged shadow in his hand, a weapon meant to finish the king for good. As Seraphina battled the empowered Valerius, she was losing. He was too strong, too fast. The blight flowed through him, making him more than human. She parried another blow, the force of it jarring her down to her bones. She saw the opening Valerius gave her as he focused on the weakened king. But Alistair saw it too. He met her gaze across the corrupted throne room. In his eyes, she saw it all. The regret, the apology, the horrifying weight of his atonement. He gave her a final, almost imperceptible nod. He knew he couldn't win, but he could still save her. He could still save the kingdom. With the last of his strength, a dying Alistair pushed off the doorframe. He charged, not at Valerius's front, but at his side. He was not aiming to land a blow. He was aiming to become a barrier, a sacrifice. He was throwing himself directly into the path of the killing magic Valerius was preparing, ready to give her the one thing he had left to give. An opening. Alistair lunged forward, not with a king's grace, but with the raw desperation of a dying wolf. His clumsy charge stained the stone floor with his lifeblood. It was enough. Valerius turned his head for a single fatal second, his eyes wide with annoyance. In that breath of time, Seraphina moved. Her hand found a jagged shard of obsidian from the ruined altar. Its edges were impossibly sharp, humming with the blight's vile energy. Her attack was silent and swift. She drove the obsidian shard deep into Valerius's side, where the black mist converged on his body. There was no human cry of pain. A sound like shattering glass echoed in the throne room as a blinding purple-black light erupted from the wound. Valerius stared down at the shard, his face a mask of disbelief. The dark power recoiled from him, the black veins on his skin withering into dust. He stumbled back and collapsed onto the cold stone, no longer a vessel of power, just a man undone by his own greed. The silence was broken by a ragged gasp. Alistair was on his knees, a hand pressed to the deep wound in his torso. Seraphina rushed to his side, the fury of battle leaving a hollow ache. His face was pale, his breathing shallow. She knew that wound, it was mortal. He met her gaze, his cobalt eyes clouded with pain but clear with purpose. She knelt, helping him stand, his arms slung heavily over her shoulders. Wordlessly, she guided him from the throne room. They moved through the embattled halls, a slow, painful procession past the ghosts of his ambition. She led him not to the healers, but toward the castle's ancient heart. They emerged into a courtyard where a single colossal silver-bark tree grew. This was the heart tree, its leaves shimmering with a faint inner light. She helped Alistair to its base, where he slumped against the trunk, his strength gone. He looked up at her, gesturing to the glowing bark, then to his own chest. "Use it," he whispered. "My life, the ritual demands a price. Let my life pay the debt. Let it be my one true act as king." Seraphina looked down at the man who had built her a throne of lies. She saw the boy she had trained with, the alpha she had loved, and the king who had betrayed her. He was offering his life to atone for a sin that had cost her everything. A single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. It was a tear of release. She reached out, her fingers brushing his cheek. "I forgive you, Alistair," she said softly. The words were for the girl who had been forged in pain. She was letting her go. She placed one hand on the smooth bark of the heart tree. She laid her other palm flat against Alistair's chest, over his failing heart. The moonstone amulet at her throat began to burn with a cold silver fire. Power surged through her. The ritual demanded a life, pulling at Alistair's, but Seraphina resisted. Her magic was not about sacrifice. It was about healing. She reached deeper, past the flesh and bone, to the invisible thread that still connected their souls. The mate bond. With a silent scream that echoed only in her mind, she seized it. She poured their shared history, the love and the rage, the promise and the pain, into the ritual. It was an agony unlike any she had ever known. The bond frayed, stretched, and then, with a final soul-shattering snap, it broke. A wave of pure silver light erupted from the heart tree. It pulsed outwards, washing over the castle and across the dying lands. Everywhere the light touched, the black moss withered, and the sickened land drew a cleansing breath. The light washed over Alistair, his fatal wound knitted shut, and his breathing steadied. He opened his eyes, and when he looked at her, the possessive fire of the alpha mate was gone. They were free. Months passed. The kingdom breathed again. In a small village, a man with jet black hair and familiar blue eyes lifted a heavy timber, helping rebuild a home. He wore no crown. When he smiled, there was a quiet peace on his face. He was just Alistair. Far away, at the edge of the thriving woods, Seraphina stood with her hand resting on the bark of the heart tree. She was a silent guardian, bound to no one but herself. She felt the wind whisper through the leaves, and for the first time in a very long time, she was at peace.